Hello and welcome to tonight's presentation. This is the second in a series of videos I'm doing on Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito in relation to the murder of Meredith Kercher in 2007. In the first video, I presented all the facts against Raffaele and Amanda, or those that appeared to be against them. But now I'd like to draw your attention to a fundamental adage or principle in law, that it's a capital mistake to come to any conclusion before considering all of the evidence. All of the evidence means the evidence of the case and also the law that applies to it, the articulation between the case and the law. So the presumption of innocence must be maintained if there is reasonable doubt. And now I'd like you to consider the following facts. There was a witch hunt which Italy had not seen for 50 years against Amanda, and a smear campaign in the press. On top of that, information was leaked from the prosecutor's office, which is absolutely scandalous, and this was done on a regular basis. And basically it tapped into the deep dichotomy in the Italian psyche, or I should say the psyche of many Italian people, between the virgin and, shall I say, a woman of loose virtue. And Amanda's striking looks and angelic face seemed to suggest to some, in their imagination and in view of the lurid tales that were being put across the press about her sex life, which really was completely irrelevant to this case. In fact, they tricked her when she was in prison using a particularly dirty trick, saying that she was HIV positive, and got her to make a list of her sexual partners, only to announce the truth to her later, that in fact she wasn't HIV positive, and this had just been a means of extirpating out of her the list of all the men she'd slept with. That is a very illegal and very immoral thing to do. So the smear campaign affected the minds of everybody in Italy, and finally in the world, because the case had an international resonance. So it's clear that all the members on the jury that were non-sequestered on that first jury where she was condemned along with Raffaele, their minds were completely tainted with all of these stories against Amanda. And this means, in my legal opinion, that those jurors were not able to arrive at an intimate conviction based on objective criteria. So that's point number one that has to be taken into consideration. The second one is that Amanda alleged that she had been hit twice in the back of the head and subjected to very harsh interrogation tactics. Now, the Italian law specifies that the police have to produce a tape of all interviews of those accused. In the absence of that tape, the burden of proof is on the prosecution and police. They have to prove, basically, that they did not use violence in that interview. Now, since they cannot produce or have not produced that tape, it means that Amanda's allegations have to be taken seriously. And if indeed they used these tactics, which have been involved for hardened mafia criminals to break them, and they used them on a young girl that was a little bit doped up and frankly a little bit out of her clear mind, because of the dope, because of circumstances, because of everything that was going on, it means that technically speaking, from a legal point of view, the admission that she was in the house was based on police brutality and therefore should be inadmissible in court. And I'm not just talking about American standards of justice, I'm talking about Italians' own system and their jurisprudence. If the police violate the law, if they brutalize somebody during an interrogation, if they're unable to prove that they didn't, then what she said is inadmissible. So it's very possible that the police planted in her mind and forced on her, saying, "We know you were at the cottage, we know you were at the cottage," and she simply broke down after hours and hours of interrogation, which she describes in her book. She said she was literally destroyed by the interrogation. Therefore, that admission should be non-admissible in court, which would change the entire case, or certainly go a very long way to establishing reasonable doubt, which I'll get back to at the end of this. So that was a grave violation of her rights. The next fact that I'd like you to consider is that both Raffaele and Amanda were placed in solitary confinement for many months. This is a clear violation of their international human rights, and they could take this up at The Hague, which actually is higher than any national law. So another grave violation of their rights. When you add to this the fact that they were denied legal representation and that Amanda was told, if you had a lawyer here, it would only make things worse for you, this means that her rights were severely severely broken. And she was indicted in prison before she'd had time to confer with her attorney, which further compounds the fact that they obstruct her access to legal counsel. So when you put all of these things together, what we're seeing is a pattern of grave irresponsibility at the worst, or a concerted will to violate the rights of young people. Now, I mentioned in the other video that her behavior was considered very insensitive, that at the police station, for example, when Meredith's friends were there present, and they asked her, Amanda, because they thought she had some information which they didn't, do you think Meredith suffered? And she said, what do you expect? She had her effing throat cut. Gross insensitivity, as distasteful as we may all find it, is not in itself an indicator of guilt. So once you take away the smear campaign and all the allegations that were made about her sexuality and what I've just mentioned, it means that we can't judge Amanda on behavior which we found distasteful. The legal criteria have to apply. Now let's just add something else. Minini, the prosecutor in the first case that successfully prosecuted her, had worked on another case called Il Monstro da Firenze, the Monster of Florence. And he'd unsuccessfully prosecuted that case. But what was his thesis? That there'd been a satanic ritual sexual act, and that was his basic thesis. And he transposed that thesis to the Knox case, or to the Meredith Kercher case. So we can see that he had a fixation on a very strange subject, which could have been his fantasy. He also is known to have dabbled in the occult. And that undermines fundamentally the credibility of the basic thesis against them. They never established any proof that there had been a group sexual act. What they did establish is that Rudy Godet, who's been imprisoned now for this crime, whose DNA and blood was all over that murder room, that he had sex with Meredith, but there's no proof whatsoever linking Amanda Raffaele. And now let's just get to the proof that they alleged very briefly. They said there was a knife that had Meredith's DNA on it, but when it came to actually doing the tests, it turned out there was such a small amount of this substance that they couldn't do 2 tests, which means that it doesn't meet any of the forensic standards that these type of tests do, and therefore it's not admissible in court and it has to be dismissed. They said that Raffaele's DNA was on the bra clasp of Meredith that they found in her room. But what turned out is that for 6 weeks they left that bra clasp on the floor. They didn't collect it as evidence, they didn't bag it, and in the filming, when they're collecting the evidence, you see them pick it up with gloves that have touched other objects, a clear violation of the way evidence is supposed to be collected, and therefore it's not necessarily, but it is definitely possible that that was contaminated, so it cannot be used in court. So that means that there's no evidence to place either Raffaele or Amanda inside the murder room. And as Raffaele's lawyer, Bongiorno, clearly stated, if they had been part of such a horrendous murder with such extreme violence, necessarily their DNA, their blood, hair samples, fingerprints would be all over the chamber. So the prosecution has a very, very serious problem there. They don't have the physical evidence, and they don't have a motive. No credible motive was ever advanced during the whole trial as to why Amanda Raffaele would possibly have engaged in such an act of savagery. They talked about some jealousy between roommates, some bad feelings because Amanda was not very popular with Meredith and her friends because she was deemed loud and a bit obstreperous and a bit obtrusive, and she wasn't very clean, and they didn't like some of the people that they alleged she brought back to the house, although in the end it turned out to be 2 men and she had sex with neither. So no clear motive was established. So in way of conclusion, what I'd like to say is, no matter what you may think from what you've read on the internet, from what you've read in the press, from watching Amanda in interviews, that remains your opinion, which you're entitled to, but here the law must be applied, and reasonable doubt exists. It's a very fundamental principle and exists in Italy as well as the United States, and it states that unless you can prove beyond reasonable doubt that people are guilty, a person is guilty, they must be set free. And I submit to you here that very clearly reasonable doubt does exist. And when we look at the other person involved in the crime, Rudy Goudet, it should be noted, for reference, that he had a history in crime of breaking and entering, that he'd used a knife before in self-defense, threatening somebody when he'd been caught breaking and entry, and he had a very strange pattern of what they call psychogenic displacement phenomenon, which means that he'd wake up in the night and he wouldn't know where he was, and he would have walked miles from his house, and he did strange things in a sleepwalking type of state. For example, his friends attested to the fact that he barked like a dog, that he talked in a strange way, that his eyes were half closed. If you have any curiosity regarding this, go on YouTube and type in Rudy Goudet, and he talks in this strange state with his eyes kind of turned up. You don't know if he's asleep or he's awake, about being Dracula and sucking people's blood, which is very sinister when you view it retrospectively. So, again, to conclude, in my opinion, very clearly, with my legal expertise, reasonable doubt exists for all of the reasons outlined above, and no matter what you may think about this, it's irrelevant. All of our thoughts are irrelevant. The law must apply. Reasonable doubt exists, and my prediction is that in the trial, Raffaele and Amanda will be set free because they do not have a solid case against her due to police negligence, due to police brutality, and due to having completely bungled this case. Thank you.